Murderer's Luck by Cyril, Hare. Everybody who knows London knows the Progress Club. It's one of the most impressive buildings in Pall Mall, and every line of its architecture proclaims that for the best people, progress stopped in 1850, or thereabouts. I'm not a member, but my friend Prothero is, and I was his guest there at dinner one evening recently. Prothero likes to call himself a criminologist. Murder is his hobby, and I've long since lost count of the famous crimes which he has written up. I was not surprised, therefore, that among the friends of his who joined us in the smoking-room after dinner was a rather exalted official in Scotland Yard by the name of Restall. Over our coffee and liqueurs, Restall happened to ask me whether I'd been in the club before. "Yes, but not for several years. I remember that the last time I was here, the member who entertained me was Sylvester Kemble." It was not a very tactful remark, seeing that Kemble had quite recently been hanged for murdering his wife, but my companions took it in good part. "I've always thought," said Prothero, rather pontifically, "that the Kemble case was one of the most successful examples of modern detective methods. It was a great triumph for our police organisation, and for you personally, Restall." "Well, if you say so. But as a matter of fact, it was only by the merest stroke of luck that we obtained the evidence to bring it home to him." "Luck?" said Prothero. "When you come to think of it, it's astonishing how often the most astute and careful criminal is defeated by some quite unforeseen accident, often by an extravagantly unlikely event which he could not possibly have guarded against. Take the Abertillery murder, for example." But we never took the Abertillery murder. A man in the far corner of our group interrupted without ceremony. "The unluckiest murderer within my recollection was Anthony Edward Fitzpatrick Pugh." Everybody turned to look at him. He was not much to look at, a small, insignificant fellow with a disagreeably complacent expression. I recollected that his name was Hobson, and, like myself, he was present as the guest of a member. "Pugh?" repeated Prothero, and contrived to make the sound almost insulting. "Pugh, did you say?" "Anthony Edward Fitzpatrick Pugh." "Well, you surprise me very much. I think I am tolerably well acquainted with every crime of any significance during the last century and a half, and I have never come across that name before. Restall, are you familiar with the case of the homicidal Mr. Pugh?" Restall shook his head. "You see, Mr. Hobson, you appear to be the possessor of knowledge quite unknown even to Scotland Yard. I hesitate to make the suggestion, but are you quite sure of your facts?" "Perfectly. Would you care to hear them?" "We are all ears." Prothero settled himself back in his chair with an indulgent smile. "It's a very simple story, really. I only mentioned it because whenever the subject of bad luck comes up, it always brings Pugh to my mind. Mind you, he deserved his luck, as people generally do. He was a disagreeable type, as selfish and greedy as they make them. His bad luck began when he entrusted practically the whole of his fortune he had inherited from his parents to a get-rich-quick scheme in the city. He should have known better, of course, but there it was. He lost the lot. Then he brought an action at law to recover his money, and he secured a judgment, quite easily, for £10,000 plus costs. It must have sounded most impressive. But it's one thing to get a decision from the courts, and quite another to make it effective, as Pugh found out. His lawyers went through the usual motions, of course, which added quite a tidy figure to the bill of costs which Pugh had to foot. But it was no good. Their man went gracefully and artistically bankrupt. Pugh could whistle for his money. It simply wasn't there. What made things still more aggravating for him was that destitution did not seem to make the slightest difference to the man's lifestyle. He remained in residence on his comfortable estate in Sussex. He continued to travel up to London every day with a reserved seat in a first-class smoking compartment, and the porters touched their caps to him. Poor Pew lived in the same neighbourhood and caught the same train, but he travelled third-class, non-smoker, because he grudged the cost of a packet of cigarettes, thinking about his £10,000 every mile of the way. The secret of the happy bankrupt's prosperity, of course, was that he had personally never owned anything. Every stick and stone of the Sussex mansion, the pedigree jerseys in the park, the racehorses in the stables, the money that paid for servants' wages and the butcher's bills, and the first-class fares to London, the whole boiling, in fact, was the sole separate property of his wife, who was incidentally a very attractive, good-natured woman, and much too good for her scamp of a husband, who treated her extremely badly. The daily encounter on the railway station platform made Pew feel positively murderous. One could hardly have blamed him if one fine morning he'd slaughtered the man out of hand. But Pew wasn't that sort. Money was what he cared about, not revenge. Killing his debtor would do nothing. What he wanted was to find a means to get his 10,000 back. And the only way he could think of doing that was that making sure that somehow it was in his debtor's pocket, where the lawyers could get it. He thought the matter over in a cold-blooded way, and he hit upon a very simple, logical solution. The fellow had made his property over to his wife. Pew proposed to reverse the process. He could be fairly certain that in such a set-up the lady would have made a will leaving everything to her husband, so he only had to put her out of the way, and there would be more than enough money in the husband's hands to satisfy his little claim. That was his calculation, and as it turned out, he was dead right. Once having made up his mind to commit the murder, he carried it out with great simplicity and ease. He discovered by observation that his intended victim was in the habit of driving herself into Worthing every day. To get to the main road from the park, she had to go through a gate across the drive, which was kept shut on account of the Jersey cows. He concealed himself behind a hedge at that point, waited till she came along, and then shot her through the head at close range as she got out of the car to open the gate. He used an old German pistol he'd picked up years before. There were quite a few knocking around at second-hand shops and dealers after the war. Then he walked quietly away, leaving the pistol in the hedge. He saw no reason why anyone should connect him with a woman who he'd never spoken to in his life. And indeed, there was no one.
Well, how was he convicted?
But he wasn't. I never said he was. I merely said he was the unluckiest murderer within my recollection. And that is strictly true. Because, you see, although he had been absolutely right and completely successful in his crime, he never got his £10,000. Pew had been so careful to avoid being suspected himself that it never occurred to him to wonder who would be likely to be accused of a crime instead. But of course, when a rich woman with a penniless husband is murdered, there's one obvious person for the police to pick upon. If you don't mind my putting it that way, Mr. Restle. If Pew had thought the matter out a little more carefully, he would have seen that he was the one person he could not afford to have convicted. For when the authorities began to look into the case against the husband, Pew's bad luck started to operate in real earnest. It turned out that the couple had had a flaming row that very morning. The wife was actually on her way to see her lawyer about making a new will at the moment when she was killed. It turned out further that the cheap revolver Pew had used was the dead spit of one owned by the accused, and, so he said, lost by him only a week or two before. Well, that made quite a sizable case against him. But the crucial piece of evidence arose from the unlikeliest stroke of luck you could imagine. A witness was found to prove that the husband was near the scene of the crime within 10 minutes or so of the critical moment. He was the prisoner's gardener, and he had no business to be there at all at that hour. His presence was due solely to the fact that his wife had scalded herself by upsetting a kettle, and he was on his way to telephone for the doctor. Result: the alibi which the defence tried to set up was blown to bits, and the husband was hanged. His conviction, of course, deprived him of all his rights in the deceased's estate, and he died as penniless as he had lived. You may say, then, that Pew lost £10,000 just because somebody else's gardener's wife was a bit clumsy taking a kettle off the hob. Oh, he was unlucky, all right. Oh, so, when you come to think of it, was the chap who was convicted, of course. There was a long pause, and then Hobson's host said, "By the way, what was the husband's name? I don't think you mentioned it." Hobson didn't seem to have heard that question. He was looking at his watch. "Heavens, I'd no idea it was so late. I've a train to catch at Victoria. Do you mind if I rush away now, old man?" His departure broke up the party, and as I'm not fond of late hours, I took the opportunity to thank Prothero for a pleasant evening and made my way out. As I went, I caught sight of Restall, looking, it seemed to me, distinctly thoughtful. I found Hobson outside the club hunting for a taxi. As I may have indicated, I had not taken to the man very much, but I had my car round the corner and Victoria was on my way home, so it seemed only decent to offer him a lift. "I suppose the husband in your story was Sylvester Kemble?" I asked as we took the corner by Marlborough House. "Oh, yes, you're quite right, of course." "And so you're saying his execution was a complete miscarriage of justice? How horrible!" "Oh, you needn't waste any pity on him. He deserved all he got. His treatment of his wife alone merited hanging. You seem to know a lot about him." "Well, she was my aunt, the only relation I had in the world." I said no more until we were passing Buckingham Palace. "When did you come to learn the truth about your aunt's murderer?" "Oh, about halfway through Kemble's trial. I knew Pew fairly well. I used to discuss the evidence with him. I almost put some money in that scheme myself, but I thought better of it. Anyway, one evening Pew and I were dining together, and he got a bit tight. He slipped out something that he hadn't meant to say. I broke him down, and he told me the whole story." "What on earth did you do?" "Nothing. I looked at it this way. Kemble was every bit as bad as a murderer. I think he would probably have killed my aunt anyway in due course, if Pew hadn't got there first. And hanging Pew wouldn't have done her any good. Besides, I couldn't afford to see him hanged." "What do you mean?" Thank heavens Victoria was just ahead. I could hardly bear this man's presence any longer. "Well, I was a poor man, and I was my aunt's next of kin. If Kemble was acquitted, it meant that her will, which she never got round to changing, remember, leaving everything to him, was still good. But if he was convicted, I scooped the pool. I'm sure my dear aunt would have preferred to have it that way." I stopped the car with quite an unnecessary jerk. Hobson got out. "Thanks for the lift. Perhaps I shall see you again some day. I'm putting up for election to the Progress, by the way." I wondered, as I drove home, whether I ought to warn Prothero about this candidate for the club. But then I decided not to. After all, I'm not a member.
You've been listening to Murderer's Luck, written by Cyril Hare, and read for us today by Matthew Jones. It was recorded on location at the Progress Club, London. The club is currently looking for new members, but please remember you do have to be the right sort of chap.